My name is Rhonda Marks, and if anyone had told me that my own son would one day send me a gift meant to end my life, I would have called it madness. But on that Mother's Day morning, I opened my front door to find a package waiting for me. A sleek black box, heavy in my hands, carrying the kind of elegance you'd expect from something rare and expensive. Inside was a stunning limited edition whiskey bottle, engraved with my name, and beside it, a folded letter in handwriting I could never mistake. It was from Quinton, my firstborn. The same Quinton who hadn't truly spoken to me in years. My heart clenched as I read his words. No matter our differences, you'll always be my mother. I hope you'll enjoy this as a gesture of love. I didn't know what to feel in that moment. Part of me was touched, part of me was suspicious, but mostly I was confused. Quinton and I had been estranged for so long. He had always chosen his father over me, and I had long stopped expecting any warm gestures. And yet here it was, a gift far too beautiful to ignore. The next day my phone rang. It was Quinton. His tone was unusually warm. "Did you enjoy the whiskey, Mom?" he asked. I smiled, not realizing the weight of what I was about to say. "Oh baby, I gave it to Kiona. She loves it." There was silence on the other end. Then suddenly, Quinton's voice exploded, sharp and frantic. "You gave who?" And that was the moment everything began to unravel. Before I take you deeper into this story, let me warn you, what came after will shake you. So stay with me because every detail matters. I've heard people say that children always know which parent to lean toward, but in my house, that choice cut me deeper than any knife. I raised Quinton with discipline because I believed in boundaries, in faith, in respect. I was never the mother who let her children run wild, and I carried my Christian values like armor. I thought it would guide him. Instead, he saw it as a chain. Harold, my ex-husband, was the opposite. He was charming, reckless, and loose with rules. He didn't care about church on Sundays. He cared about fun, music, laughter, late-night drinks, and letting the kids bend whatever lines they pleased. To Quinton, Harold was freedom. To me, Harold was a man sinking, and I refused to drown beside him. The divorce didn't happen overnight. It came after years of infidelity, broken promises, and nights I waited alone while Harold was out. But when the papers were signed, something else broke too. My bond with Quinton. He clung to Harold, idolized him, and from that point on, I was the strict mother who never understood him. No matter what I did, I couldn't compete with Harold's easy love. But not all was lost. My younger son, Devon, stayed close. He understood me, even when he didn't agree with every rule. He saw the cracks in Harold's lifestyle and knew who kept the home together when things fell apart. Devon became my quiet anchor. But Quinton slipped further away. He stopped answering my calls. He skipped holidays, birthdays, even family dinners where I set his plate out, praying he would show. My texts sat unread, my voicemails ignored. And when he did speak to me, it was curt, detached, as if I were nothing more than an obligation he wished he didn't have. What hurt most was knowing I hadn't wronged him. I had only tried to raise him right. Still, in his eyes I was the enemy. And Harold was the hero. That fractured bond hardened into silence, and silence into estrangement. Looking back now, I realize that distance wasn't just emotional. It was the soil where bitterness grew, where Quinton's plans began to take root. And though I couldn't see it then, the very love I still carried for my son would one day be used as a weapon against me. I used to tell myself Quinton would grow out of it. The eye rolls, the cold silences, the way he'd measure every request of mine against whatever his father would have allowed. But resentment doesn't shrink when it's fed. It grows teeth. His laundry business became the place where those teeth showed. He rented a cramped strip mall corner with 12 machines, 8 of them older than his daughter Layla. The dryers ran hot and uneven. The water bills came like punches. The landlord wanted paint on the walls but wouldn't fix the roof stain that scared customers. I saw the grind up close the one time I stopped by unannounced. Lint bins overflowing, a wash and fold $1.50 per pound poster with a pen stroke changing the price to $2.00. A credit card processor blinking red because the merchant cash advance had already taken its daily bite. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't winning either. And that in-between space can turn a man mean if he thinks the world owes him more. He never said it outright, but I heard it in the tone he saved for me. To Quinton, I represented everything he didn't want. Discipline, budgets, boundaries, the quiet kind of sacrifice that doesn't get applause. Harold, on the other hand, represented the opposite. Music loud, rules soft, a drink for every mood, and a laugh big enough to drown a conscience. Quinton chased that feeling like a sound he couldn't let go of. When Harold called him my man, it rang in him for days. When I told him to save more than he spent, I could feel the wall go up. Kept reaching anyway. I brought Layla a winter coat and left it with the babysitter when he was on a delivery run. I sent him links to small business workshops and SBA programs. Devon told me to stop pushing, to let the relationship breathe. Tried. But I also watched the numbers in Quinton's life turn tight. Rent 2 months behind, soap supplier demanding cash on delivery, dryers chewing quarters faster than they dried towels, Yelp reviews mentioning burnt edges and missing socks. Every small failure needed a villain, and I became the easiest one, because I would always still be there. Marissa arrived in that same season. Sharp nails, a hustler's smile, and a way of filling a room that made Quinton stand straighter. She had a vision board in her phone and a list of the best corners in Orlando for a salon. Foot traffic, parking, nearby coffee, the right kind of neighbors. Quinton wanted to give it to her. He started speaking in new numbers. Lease deposits, chair rentals, Instagram ad spends. But numbers don't care about want. The laundry could barely cover his loan payments, much less seed a salon in the heart of Florida. So the gap between his life and the life he promised her became a crack he stared into at night. When a man fixates on what he can't afford, he starts inventorying the people he thinks owe him. Harold had planted a seed long before. A man has to create his own luck. Quinton twisted it into something else. Luck as entitlement, love as payout. He knew he was listed on my insurance. Years back, when he was still taking my calls, I told him I kept him as beneficiary because mothers think about storms before they see clouds. I wanted him secure if anything happened to me. Instead of gratitude, he filed it away like a safety valve the world installed just for him. The more he struggled, the more he rewrote our history to justify a solution he hadn't said out loud yet. To him, my rules became cruelty, my church became judgment, my budgeting became proof I never wanted him to enjoy anything. I heard the story harden in his voice. If I was the obstacle, then removing me was progress. It's a cruel logic, but resentment isn't logical. It just wants a target. I saw signs without knowing what they meant. Quinton started asking Harold odd questions about paperwork, out of curiosity. He probed how policies worked, how beneficiaries changed, whether payouts were taxed. He asked me once, casually, whether I still kept that old policy from the job. I remember saying yes, and feeling a pinch of sadness that he only ever called to ask for details, never for dinner. He laughed it off and pivoted to Layla's school project. But later, I replayed the call and felt the weight of the parts that shouldn't have mattered. Meanwhile, the laundry fought back. Dryer bearings grinding, a Wednesday pipe leak that cost him a day's revenue, A newer laundromat opening 5 blocks over with stainless machines and a latte bar that made people feel expensive just by being there. Quinton called it cheating, as if better planning was an unfair advantage. He took another advance with a smiling lender who promised fast approvals, waking up to discover the lender could dip into his account every weekday at 7 a.m. before he'd sold the first pound of wash. In that pressure chamber, Harold's voice got louder in Quinton's head, and mine got smaller. I became the lecture he'd already memorized and refused to hear again. He convinced himself I had chosen rules over love, forgetting that rules were the way I loved. Food on the table, lights paid, boys to bed on time, nothing glamorous, everything necessary. He wanted glory. I offered ground. He hated the ground. By the time Mother's Day approached, all the tinder was stacked. Debt, pride, the fantasy of an instant fix, and a story that painted me as the reason he couldn't step into the life he promised Marissa. I didn't know he'd already found a bottle that could carry both sentiment and sin. I didn't know he remembered the years I took a sip with Harold on good days and assumed I still did. I didn't know my name on a label would be the final piece that made the plan feel righteous in his mind. Resentment doesn't announce itself. It just rearranges the furniture in a man's heart until he can't see the door. When the package arrived, I thought I was holding an apology. Looking back, I was holding the shape of his grievance, polished, heavy, and designed to look like love. If Quinton's life had been nothing but a struggle with washing machines and late rent notices, I might have thought he'd eventually come back around. Maybe humble himself, maybe let me help him steady his feet. But then Marissa Boyd walked in, and with her came a new kind of hunger. She wasn't like his ex-wife, the quiet girl who tolerated the laundromat and his broken promises until she finally left. Marissa was sharper, louder, and unashamed about wanting more. She talked about hair shows in Atlanta, salon launches in Miami, celebrity clients who could make a place pop just by taking a picture in the chair. From the beginning, she fed Quinton a diet of ambition dressed as love. She told him he was capable of more, that he was wasting his energy folding strangers' socks and chasing quarters out of dryers. She painted visions of velvet couches in a waiting area, mirrors lined with lights, stylists in black uniforms, and her name in gold on the door. Marissa's Luxe Studio. Quinton soaked it all up because her praise made him feel like he was already that man, the provider, the builder, the king. But in reality, every time she showed him a storefront on her phone or a budget breakdown, the gap between his means and her dreams grew wider. That gap turned into pressure. He wanted to give her the world, but the numbers in his accounts laughed back at him. Every loan application came back with higher interest. Every investor he approached asked for collateral he didn't have. He was trapped in the math, but Marissa's eyes were on the lifestyle. She didn't settle for laundromat talk. She wanted opening parties, champagne glasses clinking, and Instagram pages full of high-end clients. Quinton told her he would make it happen. He promised, because promises came easy when the alternative was losing her. And that's when he started looking at me, not as his mother, not as the woman who raised him, but as a means to an end. He remembered what I had once told him in passing, that I had made him the beneficiary of my life insurance, because mothers think about the storms before they see clouds. I had said it with love, but Quinton twisted it into entitlement. To him it wasn't a gift. It was a guarantee. In his mind, I became a number on a policy. A number that could be unlocked. A number that could build Marissa's salon, buy her the lifestyle she expected, and finally prove to himself, and to her, that he wasn't small, wasn't stuck, wasn't a man who failed at everything he touched. It is a cruel thing when a son decides that his mother must die, not because of hatred, but because of ambition. That was the point where Quinton's resentment hardened into logic, where fantasy became planning. And as he held Marissa's hand and promised her the future, he had already chosen the price. My life. I can still see how carefully Quinton staged his plan, how deliberate every choice was. Nothing about it was rushed, and that's what makes it sting the most. He thought it through step by step like a business proposal. He wanted it to look like love wrapped in glass. He went online and found a specialty company that engraved liquor bottles for anniversaries, retirements, and birthdays. He picked the darkest whiskey they offered, the kind meant to look rich and rare, then paid extra to have my name etched into the glass. To Mom with love, Quinton. The packaging came with a velvet lining and a handwritten note option, but he declined that last feature. He wanted his own handwriting to speak louder than any machine. The poison wasn't something he stumbled into. He searched, he asked questions, and he spent money on it. He didn't buy anything reckless that would stand out on a pharmacy camera. He picked something quiet, something soluble, something that could pass in the burn of whiskey without a second thought. He measured it carefully into the bottle, resealed the cork, and held it up to the light like he had just bottled reconciliation. But what tied the bow on his scheme was the letter. He sat at his kitchen table with Marissa out running errands, folded a sheet of lined paper, and wrote in a tone that felt just believable enough. No matter our differences, you'll always be my mother. I hope you'll enjoy this as a gesture of love. Maybe this can be a new beginning for us. His loops were wide. His ink smudged where his hand rested, and the words dripped with a tenderness he hadn't shown me in over a decade. He sealed the letter and slid it into the box beside the bottle, then arranged it all back into the packaging like a jeweler setting a diamond. He wanted me to see a son reaching for his mother, not a son calculating her death. And that confidence came from one flawed assumption, that I still drank. He remembered the days when Harold and I were still married, when I would sip a glass of whiskey with him on summer nights. That was his last memory of me and alcohol. He never cared to notice that I had put the bottle down years ago, both for my health and for my faith. It was that single mistake, that blind reliance on the past, that turned his perfect plan into a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was sending me a peace offering. He was really sending me the proof of how little he ever truly knew me. When I think back to it, my choice felt so small, so ordinary, the kind of gesture people make every day without thinking twice. The whiskey had sat on my counter for hours, the glass catching bits of morning light, the letter folded neatly beside it. I had read Quinton's words again and again, trying to decide if they meant anything. Part of me wanted to believe they did. Another part of me knew better. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to drink it. I had stopped years ago. First for health, then because my walk with God no longer made room for something that had once been Harold's joy and my weakness. I didn't hate whiskey, but I no longer welcomed it. And as I stared at that heavy bottle, I remembered a chance encounter a few weeks earlier that gave me an idea. It was at the mall a Saturday afternoon, when I ran into Kiona, Harold's wife. For years, I had told myself I wouldn't know what to say if we ever met face to face. But that day proved different. She was pleasant, polite, even warm. We stood near the jewelry counter and talked about little things. Her job, my church, and then Harold. She laughed as she told me how much he loved his whiskey, how they sometimes shared a glass in the evenings after long days. It keeps him settled, she said, smiling in a way that made me realize she meant it as affection, not complaint. That memory returned as I looked at the bottle. Seemed almost perfect. Instead of letting the gift sit unopened, I could pass it along to someone who would actually appreciate it. Kiona's words had made me believe she enjoyed it as much as Harold, and giving it to her felt like a graceful gesture, a way to show kindness despite the complicated history between us. So I packed it back into its box, tucked the letter inside without much thought, and delivered it. No malice, no second-guessing, just a decision that felt right at the time. I remember her surprise when she saw it, the way her eyes widened at the engraved glass. "This is beautiful," she said, and I could tell she meant it. I left her smiling, feeling oddly at peace, proud even, that I had chosen generosity instead of suspicion. I had no idea then that what I thought was kindness was really the match to a fuse already lit. That small act of passing the bottle on would set off a chain of events I could never take back. Events that would tear open every secret and every loyalty in our family. I can still see the night in my mind, though I wasn't there when it happened. Kiona told me later, through trembling lips and a hospital blanket draped over her, what unfolded. She and Harold had decided to open the whiskey that very evening. She wanted to surprise him with something special after dinner, toasting not just to Mother's Day but to the years they had managed together in spite of the storms. The bottle gleamed under their kitchen light. Harold admired it, impressed by the engraving. "Rhonda must have sent this," he joked at first, half in disbelief, but Kiona quickly corrected him. "No, it was from Quinton. Your son wanted to honor his mother. Rhonda thought I might enjoy it instead." Harold chuckled at the idea, then pulled down 2 glasses. They poured small servings, clinked glasses, and drank. At first it was laughter, soft music in the background, the comfortable quiet of a couple winding down. But within an hour, the laughter slipped into unease. Kiona described it as a sudden heaviness in her chest, the room spinning, her throat tightening. Harold wasn't faring better. His speech slurred, his face flushed unnaturally. He staggered toward the phone, but his legs buckled beneath him before he could reach it. Somehow Kiona managed to grab her cell phone, her fingers clumsy but determined. She dialed 911. Gasping for air as she begged for help. By the time the ambulance arrived, Harold was unresponsive, his pulse faint. They worked on both of them in the emergency room, tubes and machines rushing to take over what their bodies were failing to do. Kiona survived, her body fighting back with the aid of doctors, but Harold never woke again. The poison had done its work. When the call reached me, I felt the world tilt. A gift I had passed along, an act I thought was kindness, had become the weapon that ended Harold's life. I sat in my living room staring at the wall, my phone pressed to my ear, barely hearing the words. "He's gone. Harold didn't make it." The tragedy hit the Marks household like a storm no one expected. What was meant to look like reconciliation, a son honoring his mother, had turned lethal. Kiona clung to survival, Harold was gone, and I was left with a knot of guilt and confusion that made it hard to breathe. I had carried the bottle into her hands, never knowing it was already marked for death. The day after Harold died, I found myself sitting in a stiff chair across from 2 detectives, their notebooks open, their eyes heavy with suspicion. It didn't matter that I hadn't seen Harold in years, or that I had moved on from the marriage that nearly broke me. What mattered was that the poisoned bottle had passed through my hands. To them, that was enough to make me the first suspect. They laid out their reasoning bluntly. I was the ex-wife. I had history, motive, bitterness if I wanted it. They spoke of divorce like it automatically bred revenge. "Mrs. Marks," one of them said, leaning forward, "why give your ex-husband's wife such an expensive bottle? That's not typical, is it?" The way his words hung in the air, I could tell they expected me to stumble. But I didn't. I told them the truth exactly as it happened. I described the package on my doorstep, the engraved bottle, Quinton's letter folded neatly beside it. I explained how I hadn't touched whiskey in years, how my health and faith no longer allowed it. And then I shared the moment at the mall when I'd run into Kiona, How she had laughed about evenings spent sharing a glass with Harold. It just felt right, I said. Why let it sit and gather dust when she could enjoy it? They pressed harder. Had I resented Harold's marriage to her? Did I feel replaced, humiliated, cast aside? I looked them both in the eyes and said, I left Harold because I refused to be dragged through his lifestyle. If I wanted him gone, I wouldn't have wasted decades raising his children and rebuilding my life after him. It was my calm that began to shift the tide. Not defensiveness, not anger, just steady truth. They didn't expect that. When they asked to see the letter, I produced it, Quinton's handwriting still bold across the page. I pointed out the engraving on the bottle, the expense of it, the message it carried. Does this look like something I would create for myself, just to destroy him? Yes. That letter planted the first seed of doubt. If I hadn't bought the bottle, who had? If I hadn't written the words, then whose handwriting was it? Piece by piece, the line between me and the poison began to blur in their eyes, but not in my favor. For Quinton, the spotlight was inching closer. I left the station that evening drained. My name not yet cleared, but no longer the only name they whispered. I knew the road ahead would be long, but one thing was certain. I would not allow lies to bury me. If Quinton thought his gift would go down without questions, he underestimated both the truth and the mother he tried to erase. The day Quinton sat across from detectives, he wore the mask I knew too well, the practiced charm he'd learned from Harold, the smirk that passed for sincerity. He came in with his shirt pressed, his voice low and heavy with grief. I can't believe my father's gone, he said, shaking his head as though the words alone were unbearable. To anyone else it might have sounded convincing. To a mother it was performance. He denied everything. When asked about the whiskey, he claimed ignorance. That was between Mom and Kiona, he said, his eyes darting just slightly toward the table. He swore he hadn't known about any special delivery. He insisted he had no reason to hurt Harold, no reason to harm Kiona. I was just trying to rebuild my relationship with my mother, he added, putting weight on words he thought would cast him as a peacemaker. But detectives didn't just hear words, they watched the spaces between them. His answers came too rehearsed, his pauses too long. And then came the cracks, small but impossible to ignore. They knew about his laundry business, how it barely kept afloat. They had his financial records, those merchant advances cutting into his bank account before sunrise every morning. He spoke of managing just fine, but the paper trail told another story. Bills overdue, equipment on its last legs, rent behind. And then there was Marissa. She wasn't in the room with him, but her presence lingered in his words. Detectives already knew about her salon dreams. He had spoken too freely in public, bragging about plans to open big in Florida. He told friends he was on the verge of something massive. Yet his books showed nothing but red. Ambition without money is like gasoline without fire. It waits for a spark. Quinton tried to keep the mask on, but every question tightened it around his face. Why would your mother give Kiona the bottle? One detective asked. Quinton stammered, fumbling for an answer. Maybe she didn't want it. I don't know. His voice cracked for the first time. They pressed harder. You sent her a letter. You wrote those words. Why? He shifted in his seat. Because she's my mom. I wanted her to know I still cared. But even that sounded hollow. Detectives compared his feigned grief against the weight of evidence piling in the background. The engraving, the poison traces, the payments for a bottle he swore he'd never ordered. The image of a grieving son was beginning to collapse under the shadow of a desperate man with too much to lose. He left the station that day walking tall, but suspicion clung to him like smoke. They weren't done with him, and he knew it. What he didn't know was just how deep they were willing to dig, and how quickly the ground beneath his story was giving way. It didn't take long before the mask Quinton wore finally slipped, not in his words, but in the evidence he couldn't erase. Detectives pieced together the trail with the patience of men who'd seen it all before. They started with the whiskey itself. Forensics confirmed what the hospital doctors had already suspected. The bottle had been tampered with. Traces of poison, carefully measured, dissolved cleanly in the amber liquid. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a manufacturing flaw. Someone had turned that bottle into a weapon. From there the paper chase began. They traced the order back to an online boutique specializing in luxury bottles. The account was under a name Quinton thought would shield him, but the payment didn't lie. His own debit card tied to his business account had been used. The shipping address originally listed was his laundromat, later rerouted to my home. When confronted with the receipt, his claim of ignorance fell flat. Then came the money trail. Quinton had been drowning in debt for months, the laundry bleeding quarters while lenders yanked cash from his account daily. Detectives uncovered bank statements littered with overdraft fees, overdue notices, and cash advances from lenders known for preying on desperate owners. It painted the picture of a man living on borrowed time. Marissa's name surfaced next. Detectives pulled phone records and text exchanges between them, and the words were damning. "We need this soon," she wrote in one message. "Once the salon opens, we'll be set. No more small life." Quinton replied with promises, words that reeked of urgency. He talked about finding a way and handling it before summer. It didn't say murder, but it didn't have to. The timing and the context made the picture clear. His alibi unraveled just as quickly. Quinton had told them he spent Mother's Day weekend working late at the laundromat, handling overflow before the new week. But security footage showed otherwise. The cameras across from his shop caught him leaving early, carrying a package that matched the dimensions of the whiskey box. Detectives compared the timestamps with the shipping reroute request, and the puzzle locked into place. Piece by piece, the image of the grieving son collapsed. What remained was a man cornered by debt, driven by ambition, and willing to gamble with blood for a payout. The golden ticket he thought he had found was beginning to look more like a noose tightening around his own neck. By the time detectives laid the evidence side by side, the poisoned whiskey, the online order, the financial ruin, and Marissa's relentless dreams, there was little left for Quinton to hide behind. The bottle he had once lifted to the light with pride now glowed with proof of his guilt. The day Quinton's lies finally fell apart, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the shuffle of every paper, the faint creak of wooden benches as people shifted in their seats. I sat beside Devon, his hand gripping mine so tightly it felt like he was trying to hold us both together. We weren't there as spectators. We were there as family, torn apart by the very man sitting at the defense table in a suit that couldn't hide the weight of betrayal. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the double life Quinton had tried to live. They painted him as the son who idolized his father, the boy who saw Harold as freedom and me as a prison. They traced how that worship turned into resentment, how his loyalty to Harold was so blinding that he convinced himself killing me was justified, even profitable. And then, with devastating precision, they showed how his plan twisted on itself. The poison meant for me ended up in Harold's glass, killing the man Quinton claimed to love above all else. I sat frozen as they displayed the evidence. The receipt for the engraved bottle, his bank records dripping in red ink, and the text messages with Marissa, each line a nail in the coffin of his excuses. The jurors read the words he had written. "We need this soon." "I'll handle it before summer. The money will come." Every phrase revealed the desperation he had hidden behind a mask of ambition. Quinton tried to hold on to his performance, but the cracks were too wide now. His denial sounded brittle. His shoulders slumped under the weight of proof he couldn't outrun. And when the prosecutor reminded the jury of the letter he had written to me, "No matter our differences, you'll always be my mother," the irony filled the room like smoke. Those words, meant to cover poison, became the very rope that tied him to it. Beside me, Devon shook his head slowly, his eyes wet, his chest rising and falling with a grief I couldn't touch. He wasn't just mourning Harold. He was mourning the brother he had lost long before this trial began, the boy who once played basketball with him in the driveway, now revealed as a man capable of plotting his own mother's death. No. I sat there numb, caught between pain and clarity. The son I had carried, raised, prayed over, had stood on the witness stand and shown himself to be both betrayer and fool. His worship of Harold and hatred of me had fused into a plan that not only destroyed him but claimed Harold's life in the process. That was the moment Quinton was truly unmasked, not by detectives, not by lawyers, but by the truth itself. And as I gripped Devon's hand, I knew there was no stitching this family back together. Some betrayals don't just break trust. They burn the bridge so completely that nothing can ever cross again. The trial stretched on for weeks, but each day carried the same sting. Hearing my son's name tied to words like murder, conspiracy, fraud, intent. No mother is built for that, yet I sat through it day after day because I refused to look away from the truth. If Quinton had chosen this path, then I would watch it to the end. The prosecution laid everything bare. They walked the jury through his debts, the merchant advances pulling money out of his account each morning before he made a single dollar. They showed the receipts of his luxury purchase, the custom whiskey bottle engraved with my name. They presented the forensic reports, the poison found dissolved in the whiskey, measured with care, not accident. They spoke of his desperation and the promise he had made to Marissa, that a salon in Florida would be hers, that life was about to change. And then came the testimony that cut like glass. Marissa herself. She looked nervous on the stand, shifting in her seat, her eyes darting away from Quinton's. The prosecutor asked her about their conversations leading up to Mother's Day. At first she tried to soften it, saying Quinton only wanted to do something big. But when pressed with her own messages, her voice broke. The jury heard her words. "We need this soon. Once the salon opens, no more small life." She admitted that Quinton had spoken often of insurance money, though he never used the word kill. Still, the implication was clear, and her reluctant honesty nailed the motive in place. The defense tried to twist it, painting Quinton as a son trying to reconcile, a businessman misunderstood, a victim of unfortunate circumstance. But no story could erase the evidence. The poisoned bottle, the financial ruin, the false alibi. Every thread the defense pulled only made the knot tighter. The closing arguments were brutal. The prosecutor's voice echoed in the silent courtroom. This man did not just plan to kill his mother. He killed his father by his own hand. Greed was his motive. Desperation was his method, and arrogance was his downfall. When the jury left to deliberate, Devon and I sat in the gallery, our hearts heavy. It didn't take long. Within hours, they returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder. The judge's sentence was stern: decades in prison, no chance of parole for at least 30 years. I watched as Quinton stood there, his jaw set, his eyes refusing to meet mine. The boy I had once tucked into bed now faced the rest of his adult life behind bars. The gavel struck, sealing his fate. And in that moment I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just the cold weight of finality. My son had chosen greed over family, poison over love, and in doing so, destroyed everything he claimed to cherish. After the trial ended and Quinton was led away in shackles, people expected me to collapse under the weight of it all. Some even told me, "He's still your son," as if that was reason enough to leave the door cracked. But love does not mean blindness, and forgiveness does not mean letting a knife remain in your back. Quinton had made his choice, and now it was my turn to make mine. The first thing I did was call the insurance company. My hands trembled only once, when the representative asked me to verify the beneficiary on file. Hearing Quinton's name read aloud was like swallowing glass. But I steadied myself and spoke clearly. "Remove him. Effective immediately. Replace him with my youngest son, Devon Marks, and my granddaughter, Layla Marks." It was more than paperwork, it was a declaration. Quinton had spent months twisting the thought of that policy into his golden ticket, the key to a future with Marissa, the justification for my death. By erasing him from it, I severed the last tie he believed he had to my life. He would not profit a single cent from my existence, nor from my passing. Instead, the ones who had loved me, the ones who had stood by me, would be the ones to carry forward. I didn't stop there. I reviewed every document with my lawyer. My will, my accounts, even the house deed. Wherever Quinton's name once stood, I stripped it away. In his place, I etched Devon's and Layla's. It wasn't spite, it was justice. It was my silent revenge, carried out with ink and signatures rather than anger. Financially, Quinton was erased from me. Emotionally, I closed that chapter as well. For years I had prayed for reconciliation, hoped for his call, longed for his presence at the table. But that son no longer existed. In his place was a man who looked at me and saw nothing but money to be unlocked. You cannot nurture love in soil poisoned by greed. When I left the lawyer's office that day, the air felt lighter. Not joyful, just final. Quinton had already destroyed himself in court, but this was my way of making sure he could never reach through bars and pull one more piece of me down with him. He was cut off once and for all. My revenge wasn't loud. There were no fireworks, no declarations. It was quiet, legal, irreversible. And in that silence, I found a measure of peace. Prison has a way of stripping a man of illusions, and from what I was told, Quinton learned that lesson quickly. Gone were the sharp suits he wore to court, the swagger he tried to maintain under questioning. What remained was an inmate number stitched to a uniform, a man reduced to the consequences of his choices. He couldn't stop the world outside from moving on without him, and that became its own kind of punishment. I never visited, but word reached me. He saw pictures of Layla through other hands, grainy copies passed in envelopes. My granddaughter, the child he once neglected in favor of chasing Marissa's dreams, was thriving under my roof. She had stability, she had love, and she had Devon, a steady presence who treated her as more than an afterthought. Together, we made a home where she could grow without the shadow of her father's betrayal looming over her. Devon became the son I leaned on most, the one who showed up not out of duty but out of genuine care. He took me to appointments, helped around the house, and most importantly, never let Layla feel the absence her father created. Watching him step into that role, I realized how different two brothers could become under the same roof. One chose bitterness, the other chose love. And love is what endured. Even Kiona, carrying scars of her own survival, found her way into my life in ways I never expected. The poison had nearly claimed her too, and that kind of brush with death leaves marks you can't see. Yet she didn't let bitterness consume her. Instead, she reached out. What began as polite conversations grew into a bond neither of us anticipated. We grieved Harold in different ways, but in that shared grief we built something steady. Two women once divided by a man, now connected by survival and loss. Meanwhile, Quinton watched from afar, powerless. From behind those prison walls. He knew the family he once tried to fracture was now stronger without him. The mother he sought to kill was alive and thriving. The brother he dismissed was now the cornerstone. The daughter he neglected was secure and loved. And the woman he nearly killed, Kiona, stood beside me as proof that his plan had failed in every possible way. That was the cruelest irony of all. Quinton thought he could destroy us for money, but in trying, he cemented a future where he had no place at all. The family he lost was not just taken from him by circumstance. It was a family he had given up the moment he chose greed over love. I didn't walk away from this story with triumph stamped across my face. I didn't throw parties or declare myself a winner. Revenge, when it comes from a mother's hands, is not about gloating. It's about survival, about making sure what was meant to bury you never rises again to claim another piece of your life. My revenge was quiet, legal, and absolute. Quinton had gambled everything on the belief that I was weak enough to drink from that bottle, blind enough not to see the trap, and foolish enough to let him profit off my death. Instead, he ended up trapped inside the very snare he set. The son who once carried my name on his bottle now carries an inmate number. The father he idolized became the unintended victim of his greed. And the mother he despised, me, remains alive, steady, and untouchable. I poured my energy into what mattered. Devon stood by my side, and together we built a foundation Layla could depend on. That little girl, who once could have been collateral damage in her father's selfish schemes, grew up in a home free from chaos. Every smile she gave reminded me why I fought so hard to keep moving forward, even when betrayal cut so deep. Kiona, too, became part of my circle, scarred but resilient. We didn't pretend Harold's death wasn't tragic, but we refused to let it become the end of us. Our bond, born out of pain, became another piece of the life Quinton had failed to imagine for me, a life full of strength, family, and peace. And as for Quinton, I locked him away in my memory the same way the state locked him away in prison. I stopped replaying what-ifs and maybes. I stopped carrying the weight of wondering if I could have saved him from himself. Some betrayals burn too hot to ever rebuild from, and his was one of them. The bitter irony of it all lingers, though. Quinton thought killing me would buy him love, luxury, and freedom. Instead, it stripped him of everything. His daughter, his freedom, and the father he adored. In trying to end my life for money, he destroyed his own. So I chose peace. I chose to cherish Devon, to love Layla with all I had, and to close the chapter on the son who mistook greed for destiny. That was my final victory. Not loud, not cruel, but lasting. The kind of revenge that doesn't just punish, it erases the betrayer's power forever. And in that silence, I found what Quinton could never buy. Peace that no one can steal.